Obviously, I'm a little bit more delayed than I thought I would be. I think you probably got the gist of that from Saturday night at 2 a.m. my time's email to say all the individual write-ups are done. So normally I do try and keep the round write-ups right after the round, but it's taken me a little bit. So what I'm trying to do is this will be focused on round one, although you're going to notice a few bleeding into round two. There's a few examples that might come up that do suggest I'm dipping into both because I'm not just going to pretend it didn't happen, but I have some separate themes. So both round one and round two can do separately, especially when we talk about the pool. So this is be more focused on round one. I've got a couple things to point out, and then we'll talk about the website and a few interesting things from the pool. Thank you so much for everyone who gave a few compliments or nice things about some of the opening videos that I've already done or some of their individual write-ups. I'm going to talk more about that kind of stuff near the end in terms of the individual write-ups. But if you took the time to listen to my pre-madness video, you'll notice I did like kind of top five. I think if I did a top five, I'd be going on for a long period of time. Plus, you also notice that there is a written piece going with each of the rounds. There's going to be similar things in some of them, but I tried to go into a little bit more detail on some in the video and some in the writing so that they kind of accompany each other. But certainly, if you want to read and watch or just one or the other, I'll take what I can get. Like I said, I do appreciate all of the comments. So for this particular video, to make it a bit shorter, we're only going to do a top three, and then I'll get into the pool stuff. So for round one, here's three things in no particular order that I thought were pretty important. Every year, the idea of refereeing comes up, and I understand it's low-hanging fruit, so I try to approach it a little bit differently. Sure, we can talk hand checks and travels or moving screens especially, but I don't really want to. I think anytime you're in a basketball tournament, and we've all watched enough sports, some of us have played enough or coached enough, it gives you something to do for a while, but really complaining isn't always the greatest thing in the world. This one's more of a specific complaint, so I'm going to justify it a little bit. Obviously, I think if we look at referees, I mean, the biggest attention going all the way back to day one of round one in the men's tournament, the Kansas-Samford game, and it's true, I think that's the game that I would focus on, but not just because of the block. Yes, we can go back and we can take a look, and obviously they maybe could have gone back and taken a look, which is more of a prelude to what I am more upset about. Just the idea of being able to do video reviews. Now, I understand one of the hardest parts of the NCAA in comparison to, say, something like the NBA. If you're an NBA fan, you've been paying attention, they kind of had a meeting. They thought scoring was high. They noticed flopping was really high. So they've made adjustments. And now across the league, they're letting a little bit more go. That's why you're seeing rises and falls of certain teams and certain moves don't work anymore. But they're one consolidated league. The NCAA, realistically, while it is one big kind of league, it's a bunch of conferences, right? And that's something that causes a lot of issue because conferences call things a little bit differently, and they might have video replay done or not done a lot differently. As someone who took some people from the Big 12, I was really nervous about Houston and ISU. They're very physical teams. If a referee is very touchy in any particular game, they could be in trouble because their defense depends on being a little bit more physical. But at least these are athletes that have been around not long enough. They can make the adjustments with the referees in that in game. What upsets me a little bit more is this concept of replay, because what they replay is obviously important, but how long it takes them. This is the thing that kills me. In the women's game, and we'll get to some of the structure difference in my second point here, so I'm not going to speak as much on that right now, but in the men's game, you may notice in the halves, it's every 4 minutes they already have a TV timeout, plus the coaching timeout. So there's already enough stoppages in play, and it's not just the boredom of sitting and watching referees stare at a screen as we watch the same thing go back and forth to see if it hit someone's shorts before it went out of bounds. Obviously, possessions are important, and putting seconds back on the clock can be important. But if you're not going to look at the block, I mean, that's obviously, there's an issue there. But that's not even my point. Kansas and Samford, I mean, Kansas was a more talented team. They're a blue blood. They've been around for, their program is more storied. Obviously, they're former national champions. Their team is, if you've been paying attention, they're a little hurt. They don't have the depth. And Samford's a pressure-based team. So in the first half, Kansas is tall and long, and they pass really well. So that's how you break a press, right? That they were very successful in getting the ball up and creating a big lead. Now, whether it's Samford made adjustments, or I'd like to argue that Kansas kind of ran out of gas. And one of the things that even pressure-based defenses do is they do make you work for every possession. There was that section near the end of the game where Samford came all the way back. And if you were watching, Kansas's jump shots, they kind of had less legs. They were a little bit short. They were a little bit off. They were making free throws still. And if they got a layup into the mix, they were still making those or dunks. But that's how Samford wanted to get back into the game. And being more physical or being in better shape or being able to run a press or being able to exhaust your team, that's strategy, right? But the referees, time and time again, at one point I looked, it was over 3 minutes to discuss a call. That's longer than a timeout, right? Because it wasn't 3 minutes from the start, but if you literally go from stop to end, you added just free timeouts. And that's not something that's a coaching strategy, right? Sometimes if you pressure, you're trying to get them to burn timeouts so they won't have them at the end. But again, that's something a coach can control, a player can control, a team can control. The arbitrariness of how long it takes them is ridiculous. I put in the write-up, I never praise the MLB for how they run anything, but at least there's a time limitation on their checks. They just press, they call ahead, it goes to a separate booth, the umps in this case, but the refs would just sit and wait, and then the call's done. And if it's not being able to see in a certain amount of time, then they say, screw it, whatever you saw on the court is what you got. We have human error, and we have to live with that. But these arbitrary timeouts, I mean, Kansas already had a massive advantage. Did they really need more? Looking at some of the differences between the men's and women's game, and if you haven't watched a lot of women's basketball, I've watched enough, but I've never watched them in the same night before. Friday night was like an overload, and then Saturday, same. We had 2 tournaments going on in the peak at the same time. I barely could hold, controllers were going flying there. But you did probably notice a few differences, and some of them are, come back historically. I mean, if you look even 100 years ago, women's basketball was obviously in a really different spot. Canadians might know a little bit more about this because the Edmonton Grads are one of them. I think it's the most successful basketball team of all time in terms of their percentages, but obviously who they were playing and how they were playing was a little bit different. One in particular, when there was a change of possession, you stopped it, and then there was a jump ball, so there's no transition point. So if you could win your jump ball, you actually could have 80% of the possessions, and the other team just could never score. Obviously, we've come a lot of way since then, but if you look at the changes in the last decade or two, and I put this in the write-up, I don't know if people knew why and how some of these changes happened, but I do think they influence a little bit more than you think. The most obvious is the quarters over the halves. Now, that was done, I think I put the year in the write-up. It was just over a decade ago, though. It was supposed to be for flow of the game. I think they wanted the games to go a little bit quicker. The only thing that kind of bums me out about that, I don't mind the quarters and whatnot, but you don't get to the 1-and-1 bonus because they don't do the fouls over half. So that's something that you kind of lose, which I know that's a very North American thing, and Europeans don't really want that in their game, but I grew up with it, and I like the idea if you make a free throw, you get a second one, and it's only for a small section of your team fouls. So for me, that's kind of something lost. But what you might also kind of notice is it does translate into the timeout structure and even the substitution patterns. So, that's fine because it's something that they can adjust and people can make strategies for. I think some of the other things that are the unwritten kind of rules. So one in particular that I could not get my head over, the home court advantage thing, that if you are one of the top 4 seeds, you get to play at your home arena. That had a massive impact. And when I say it didn't sound like I was making that point as I was making the transition, it's because the unwritten bit of the home court advantages, I mean, we're not all gamblers, and I think there's been some issues with that. Well, I guess we all are gamblers if we're in this pool, but you know what I'm talking about. The point spread actually swings about anywhere from 3 to 5 points, depending. Sometimes up to 5 to 7 points, depending on the kind of home environment. If you watch Middle Tennessee State, now that's a second round thing, I told you we'd bleed into it, against LSU, that was actually quite a game for a while. I include a little bit of the taunting, because I think that was more an interesting kind of thing to look at that I wrote a little bit more about. But that had a huge impact in the calls. I mean, Angel Reese flopped actually a couple times because the post player was giving her nothing but problems. And the referees are going to call it. Now, I do think there's still a difference sometimes with women flopping and men flopping, more at the level that I coach at than that. NCAA is a little bit tighter, but definitely I can tell you in Kenya, if a girl falls over, the referee blows the whistle and then tries to figure out what the foul might be. It's not the greatest of situations, but that's a whole other rant for a whole other day. But the home court advantage is just there's no wonder why we barely had any upsets on the women's side. That is a huge mountain to climb, right? And to place a team like that in their home ballpark, I think it just presents nothing but challenges. Take, for instance, we already know, and again, this is a round 2 game, but Stanford goes to overtime, I'd be willing to bet that they don't win. That would have been an upset if that was a neutral site and those fans were 50-50. But I think when we're starting to accept different nuances of the game, it'll be interesting to see what they keep and what they get rid of. But one of the things, and I wrote more about this because I'm very interested in the signs of positivity of this new attention to the game, is I think people will start to focus on the differences in what is intentional and then what is implied or implicit. And we saw this in terms of not the referees called, but how the media is handling the women's versus men's game. So if you read an article about Caitlin Clark swearing at a fan, that's bad reporting. She was swearing at her father. I'm not saying that's any better, but it's her father and her that have this relationship. But it is interesting that the negativity that a lot of the women had for using language that does actually exist in a lot of the men's games too. It's actually not as gender-based as you think. It's more coaching-based. There's some coaches that don't tolerate that on the court, and there's some that don't care. And the ones that don't care, athletes are going to use the language that they're okay using. And if you were, I include a video clip of Cameron Brinks and what she chose to say to the referee on her way out as she got fouled out. I do think it's something that they probably have gotten away with because people weren't paying attention as much. And so this is a sign of progress. People are definitely paying attention because they had nothing else better to write about than the fact that apparently women sometimes swear. Survive and advance. I say it almost every year. Yes, it's really good if you can lead at any point in time, especially in the early going. But often that means you took a couple underdogs and you got the bonus point, so you've jumped ahead. What's the most important is how many Sweet 16s left, how many Elite Eights, and especially, do you still have your Final Four? Do you have your finalist? And do you have your champion? Because if you do, you still have a shot. Now, obviously, I'm going to get to some of the common champions when I look at our pool in just a second. You want a unique champion, and if you don't have one, if you have one of the common champions, you got to be on top of them. But right now, that's too much to think about. Right now, it's more about who did you have and who did you have go down. Now, in terms of some of the upsets, and especially the first round, I'll try and keep it to the first round as best I can. I think the biggest one, watching Kentucky fall, watching Golick, I think I said his name right, the 10 for 20 from three-point land, never taken any twos and barely taken any through the year. Already getting an NIL deal, I believe, with an insurance company. I think that's just outstanding. I think those are the stories that people kind of play for. Unfortunately for Kentucky, and we'll talk about their situation in the next video a little bit more, they were actually somebody who, in this particular pool, that's a champion that's out. Wisconsin was the other one that went in the first round that was someone's champion, but we'll talk about that in a second. In terms of other individual performances, I think Cuisinart with 40 points, merits mentioning. Damaskin from Illinois, triple-double, 10th all-time in the tournament, I believe. And I mentioned the Stanford game in the previous bit. So Cameron Brinks did not have a phenomenal, this was a round 2 game, but still, Kiki Ariafen went off and kind of kept the minute. So some individual stuff, I think that kind of helped out. In the first 2 rounds, we only had a couple buzzer beaters. The problem was, we did have Colorado over Florida, which was an upset. That was more of a mid-range 2 with about 6 seconds left. Still pretty exciting if you look at the back and forth. So if you didn't see that, go watch the highlights. In the second round, this was kind of the issue with the second round of the tournament. I'll get to this probably more in the next video, but it was if you're going to have the clutch shots, it was actually the favorite. Like Houston was almost knocked out. If you didn't see that, they did go to overtime and they needed with under 2 seconds left, and it was their third option on an inbounds play to get it to Garcia, who hit the 3 to tie it. So exciting stuff on that front. You love to see that. So if you had any of those teams that survived and advanced, I wouldn't panic, because sometimes when we look ahead, and I will do this a lot more in the second video when I look ahead to the Sweet 16 matchups, but it's great to have a team that dominates, but it doesn't really matter. We've seen it all. Sometimes out of the first weekend, it looks like a team is just rolling, and then they just bump into a matchup. Or there's that team that just kind of struggles each game, but keeps winning. So don't let it discourage you if it was a tight one, if it was a blowout. Survive, advance, and move on. Speaking of those who did not survive the first round that were impactful for us, I already mentioned the 2 champions. Kentucky was also picked as a finalist in someone else's bracket. So was Auburn and Texas Tech. So obviously they were also Final Four picks, but more of them were Final Four picks. You get it. BYU, unfortunately, did not make it through. odd kind of bit. I don't know if everyone kind of caught this, but they were supposed to be a 5 seed. They were put down to a 6 seed by request because the 5 seed in their division or their region would have had to play Friday, Sunday, and they don't play on Sundays. Didn't matter. Didn't get out of their first matchup, so not too great for them. Texas Tech, I mentioned already. They were also a finalist. South Carolina and St. Mary's. Those are the ones that were Final Fours for us that didn't quite make the first round. We'll get to a few more in the second round. Now, on the women's side, it was much more chalky. Now, we do have an upset to talk about in round 2, but I'll get to that in round 2. There was really only one upset. I mean, all 8 seeds held on. I've never seen that before. I'm sure it's happened. I just don't remember it. But we have Middle Tennessee State taking on Louisville. I mentioned their round 2 matchup with LSU, and I think I was kind of bummed because, yeah, LSU eventually blew them out and they played better, but I thought Middle Tennessee State was putting up a fight for a while there. They certainly took Louisville out, but Louisville was not someone that I believe any of us took going into our Final Four. So while some people may have had them going on a little bit further, it wasn't detrimental. The real kind of dagger hits in round 2. So once again, if your team survived in advance, you should feel pretty fortunate. Before we get to the end of closing marks, though, I do want a couple comments about the pool. I'm going to walk through the website a little bit and just kind of see how things shook out after round 1. In the future, I'm going to focus just on our pool itself and look at just our standings and statistics. For this one, I wanted to give a little bit of numbers and kind of maybe explain the site. So just to suggest the one thing you probably should know in terms of the numbers, because if you look down here on our webpage, I did put up just the breakdown of prizes. So you'll notice in the women's side, it's one pool, 28th. You will notice that there is a 29th bracket in the pool. I believe it was someone's mistake because they didn't fill it out, so I'm not going to count that in. I don't want to delete them off because I'm worried that might actually delete them from the pool forever and for always, so we're just going to have to deal with the fact that last line's not going to count, and 28th gets their money back, whereas we got our top 3. Because there's way more in the men's, as this balances out, if you've been with the pool long enough, once you get to a certain part, I start breaking things into divisions. So that was a little confusing for people when you're trying to find your name. If it's Swiss, Kenya, now there's one person who might have the question about Swiss versus not Swiss. I will talk to that individual because I was going more Geneva and Kenya or Nairobi. And then if you're in the Western Hemisphere or Eastern Hemisphere, that's not Swiss or Kenya. That way, just to make sure if there's one division where no one's scoring anything, at least the top person gets at least 20 euros back. But normally they're represented. So someone from each of the 3 are in the top 7, or at least it's happened before that's the case. The only other issue is there was a formatting one. I thought I'd fixed it. I'd fixed it last year, but 2 years ago, this was an issue. If you look here, so we have more people if we go alphabetically by your first name. You need to command and then the kind of minus, right? If you do that a couple times, you'll know because, oops. Okay, now we go all the way down and you can get everyone. I'm so sorry. I thought I fixed it and I didn't notice that it wasn't going to be fixed. It's really only an International West and the Swiss Kenya because the other one is fine. And once you're done, you just go back to making your screen the normal size and then you can go from there. So apologies on that one. But like I said, I was about 90 brackets-ish deep before I realized that. And I wasn't about to go back and fix it. It's something I'll address for next year. On the men's side, not spoiling round 2 because you already know what happens in round 2, but just taking a quick look at some of the things that might be important to our brackets. As I was doing write-ups, I wrote down what people were picking. I probably missed a couple because I was getting pretty senile by the end there, which I will reiterate if there's a spell check, and I'm sure there is. If there's a mistake or something doesn't make sense, there's likely a run-on sentence, something I just stopped. Just let me know. I'll fix it. I'd rather it be good than not. But I did also jot down who picked what. So just to let you know for your basic information on the men's side, it was the top number 1 seeds that were the top 4 in each of the most popular finalist, Final Four, and champion. So for champion, because the order is slightly different, it's UConn, UNC, Houston, and then Purdue. Then for the most common non-number 1 seeds, you do have Duke, and then teams like Arizona, Creighton, okay, and then some of the more like the Marquettes of the world, etc. For finalists, it's a slightly different order. Purdue's the most common, but just over UConn, which is just over Houston, and then UNC is kind of the lower one there. And it's the same people. It's actually Marquette, Arizona. Weirdly enough, we did have Kentucky and Baylor in that list. Illinois, and Duke kind of makes a prominent run there as well. For our Final Fours, it's kind of the same piece, except the teams, Creighton's a lot higher in people's Final Four than some of the other lists. But again, you see ISU up there as well, Arizona, Kentucky, and then some of the same favorites. On the women's side, it is predominantly South Carolina as the most popular champion. It's not quite half the pool, but it's definitely more than a third. So math majors, you can figure it out there. Iowa is our second most popular champion. People are riding the Caitlin Clark train. We have a lot of one-offs. So in the women's bracket, if it's not one of those two, it would be really interesting. Oddly enough, UCLA has multiple people, and there's a ton with one, ranking from like the Florida States of the world, ranking LSU as a repeat champion gets one in there. So there's a ton of single digit ones there. UConn gets some love. There's a little bit more parity in the finalists. Now, once again, in the same kind of vein, 3 of the 4 number 1 seeds tend to be the more popular, and that's Iowa, South Carolina, USC is up there. Texas is definitely the number 1 seed with the least amount of love. So if you have Texas going anywhere, a lot of people liked Stanford instead. And in fact, if we look at the Final Four, it's tied for both South Carolina and Stanford as the most Final Four entries. So most people do think Stanford's going to come out. So if you had Texas, cheer early and cheer often. I think this is a really interesting because some people think LSU is going to pop through. Iowa, definitely a super popular one. No one's given, I think, well, not no one. There are some people who have Notre Dame going all the way. So there's a little bit of variance, and we did lose some people in the second round, but I'll get to that to the next video because I think I've gone on long enough. That'll end our round 1 video. Like I said, I expect 1 and 2 to come out pretty close together. So if you just want to double down and go straight to round 2, feel free. I do want to talk just quickly, and I'm going to write this later just to mention, huge thank you for anybody who gave me their brackets early. You were completely done before Thursday. And in every other year, we actually had a good balance of ones that had given to me and ones that hadn't. So when Thursday hits, if you're not aware, I can't actually see everyone's bracket unless you share it with me. Even as commissioner, I can't go in and take a look. So I don't get to see everyone's till tip off on Thursday, which means if I want to watch some games, I don't work on them all night. I pick away, and then Friday. This year I had about 100 I had to write, and that's what took me pretty much all of my Saturday and parts of my Thursday and Friday as well. So that's why things were a little bit later. In future years, if the pool's going to keep getting bigger and bigger, which is amazing, I love that we have more, and especially adding the 2 pools, really did add some brackets. It would be awesome if you considered giving me stuff because it almost killed me on Saturday, and I don't know how many more times I can go through that. Granted, you didn't ask me to do this. You don't ask me to do the write-ups. I do it on my own accord, but I think if it kept going, I don't know if this is something I can keep doing. But we'll cross that bridge when we get there next year. Like I said, it was a great round 1. We're jumping straight into round 2. So if you'd like to keep rolling, just click on the next link.